So this was a very, very difficult passage for the pilgrims, yet they showed an incredible endurance and willingness to suffer hardship. So we have this little group of people propelled by prayer, propelled by a vision, not coming to America for religious freedom, but for a much bigger vision, the idea of a new nation founded on a different set of principles, unlike anything found in England and Europe before. Well, let's say, how well did they do? Well, first of all, one of the things that happened as a result of all of those storms, they were driven off course in their ship. And as they were driven off course, they landed, or they first sighted land out on Cape Cod. We summer vacation out on Cape Cod. I go sailing there, know something about the nature of the way Cape Cod sticks out into the ocean. It's thought that it was pushed there by great glaciers. And they saw the shore of Cape Cod. They knew enough about the shoreline of North America to know that it was Cape Cod. They knew where they were. They knew where Virginia was. They were too far north, and they immediately tried to head south down toward Virginia because the contract that had been signed, or the charter as it was called, was for Virginia. But the hard winds and the weather did not allow them, even though they tried several times to go south along the outside of Cape Cod. If you think of Cape Cod as a great sandy hook, they were out at the tip. They're trying to get south, but these old square-rigged ships like the Mayflower were not very good at pointing into the wind, and it was very dangerous to be caught with the wind blowing you on a lee shore. And so they had to be careful, and after a number of tries, they decided instead to bring the Mayflower to anchor around the tip of Cape Cod, where there's a natural kind of swirl of sand, which we call Provincetown. There was a nice harbor there, so they pulled the Mayflower into the harbor, dropped anchor, and kind of caught their breaths, if you will, from this trip. They weren't beaten by the waves, of course, there. And the first thing that came to their mind was some of the people realized, hey, this is like Australia, no rules, mate down under, and so when we go to shore, there is no contract. The contract was for Virginia, there's no rules, and therefore we can do whatever we want. Well, the separatists saw that that was very much close to anarchy, and they knew that they had to do something to establish some type of order. And so they struck on the idea of pulling a piece of paper out and writing what we call the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was actually the first U.S. Constitution and the first Constitution in the world of this type. And as we talk about it in just a minute here, you will realize that this was an absolutely incredible foundational stone for the building of a new nation. But let's take a look at what the Mayflower Compact actually said. I just have some excerpts from it. It's about maybe 2.5 times longer. This pretty short, just one page. It starts out, "In ye name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken for ye glory of God and advancement of ye Christian faith, and mutually in ye presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet and convenient for ye general good of ye colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience." Notice the basic ideas here in this document. The first thing is that this is a contract under God by a group of free people to create a civil government, to frame just and equal laws, and essentially to be their servant. Let's say that again. This is a government under God of a group of free people creating a civil government to be their servant and to frame just and equal laws to protect their rights and liberties. That basic idea of this Mayflower Compact is the same idea as in our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these is life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and governments are constituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Sound a little familiar? 170 years later, this is the first Constitution in America, a group of free men and women under God creating a civil government to be their servant. And so, now you say, well, that does seem like a nice thing, but what's so unique or special about that? Well, you recall these people had a vision of planting a civilization different than the way that they did things in Europe. If you take a look at the way they did things in Europe, this becomes much sharper in how distinctive it is. Because in Europe, the basic idea was the divine right of kings. For people who were politicians, this was a good deal. The king says, God made me the king. When I say jump, you're supposed to say how high. And that was the way it was done all through Europe. And yet these people rejected the concept of the divine right of kings and said, no, the government is to be the servant of the people, protecting their God-given rights. They turned everything upside down. Now, this particular tremendous development in civil government, not only is it the beginning of our Declaration and U.S. Constitution, it is also something that to them was fairly logical, because they had done the exact same thing when they started their little New Testament church in Scrooby, England. A group of free people under God covenanted together to create a church government. They merely took their church government concept and moved it over into the area of civil government, and in this regard displaced the whole concept of divine right of kings. And in a sense, in 1620, in November, when this was signed by the Pilgrims in the Mayflower, they were putting the powder keg under the throne of King George that 170 years later would reject the divine right of kings in the American War of Independence. So we have already, before they've hardly had a chance to get dried off from their trip, they have already established a completely new idea for the foundation of a land. But this great adventure story just has barely begun.